hot and cold temperatures, the Humboldts need to be really well adapted to their environment. So to keep themselves nice and cool when they're on the hot land, you might notice that they have bare patches of pink skin around the eyes, and when they get a little bit overheated, or maybe a little bit overexcited, like they are right now during feeding time, they'll actually, quite similarly to us, if we get a little bit toasty, they'll sort of blush pink. So if you see their face go a little bit pink, then probably it's their way of losing heat and cooling themselves down. Conversely, when they're getting a little bit chilly in the water, ways that they can keep themselves warm is using their 2 layers of feathers. So they have 1 layer of feathers that are fluffy down feathers that keep them nice and warm, and the overlapping layer of feathers is quite different. It's made of very stiff needle-like feathers that really tightly zigzag over one another. Now what this does is it keeps them insulated to keep them nice and warm, but also keeps them waterproof, so when they come out of the water they can dry off pretty quickly and keep themselves nice and warm. Now all of our penguins here do actually have names, but as you can see they all look pretty similar, pretty identical, especially when they're swimming around and toddling all over the rocks. It's pretty hard to tell who is who. Now if you look at their tummies, they've all got a different spot pattern and a collection of black spots on their tummy. This is called a spot pattern, and each penguin actually has their own individual spot pattern. It's kind of like a human fingerprint. It doesn't matter how many times they molt during their lifetime, they're always going to keep that same spot pattern on their tummy. So in theory, we'd be able to tell who is who purely by using this spot pattern. But in practice, that's a little bit more difficult, as you can see, especially during feeding time. So instead, you might notice they all have wing bands, all of a different a variation of colours, and they're all also microchipped, much like you do to your cat or your dog, so we can really quickly and easily identify each individual in that way. Now they're doing some lovely swimming for you guys this afternoon. There are 3 kinds of swimming that you can look out for from our penguins. The first is known as surface swimming. Quite a few of them are doing a lovely display of that at the moment. And this is a fairly relaxed form of swimming where the penguin will simply bob along the surface of the water. Now this is really useful for them out in the wild because obviously in the wild they're not going to have 2 lovely people feeding them from a bucket of fish. They're going to have to locate their own food source. So what they're going to be doing in the wild is they're actually going to be keeping an eye out for where other seabirds are diving for fish. So that helps them really quickly and easily locate a good area to find food themselves. Once they've located a good area to find food, they will use a form of swimming known as underwater flying. And this is named so because it uses the exact same movement as flight. Their torpedo-shaped bodies help to streamline them through the water, and they'll keep their feet and legs fairly still while swimming like this, and that acts as a kind of rudder, really, to help steer themselves through the water. Now, the last form of swimming, and the fastest form of swimming, is known as porpoising. And this is where the penguin will skim really quickly across the surface of the water and leap in and out of that surface, much like a dolphin or a porpoise would. Now, this is really useful for them out in the wild for their really long fishing trips, because there's not much resistance near the surface of the water, so they can save their energy and therefore swim for a much longer amount of time. It's also really useful in the case of being followed by any predators, because if they're leaping in and out of that surface, then it's going to be much harder for a predator to keep track of them. Now this afternoon, Natalie and Kian are feeding them sprats. Other things that they would eat in the wild include sardines, anchovies, squid, and also crustaceans. You might notice that when they catch their fish, they're always swivelling it round in their beaks and they're always swallowing their fish head first. Now a lot of fish-eating birds would do this, because if they swallow their fish tail first, then all of the spines and the scales on that fish can actually get pushed in the wrong direction and actually get lodged in the bird's throat. So it's quite a clever little trick that they've learned. If they swallow their fish head first, it's always going to go down much more comfortably for them. They also have really hard, sharp, serrated beaks and spines that go down their mouth and throat to help them really grasp onto that fish in the water and helps them catch their prey much more effectively. Now, it may not look like it in this pool. You can see them all very clearly against this lovely blue pool, but they actually also have a really effective form of camouflage, and this is known as counter-shading. So if you think about it, if a penguin's swimming along in the sea, then if a predator's swimming above them, they're going to be seeing the dark back of the penguin, and that's going to be blending in with the dark ocean floor beneath them. Likewise, if there's a predator underneath, then their light tummies are going to be blending in with the sunlight coming in from the surface. So though it may not look like it, they actually have a really effective form of camouflage to help evade their predators. Now, obviously, Obviously, these guys, like any wild animals, are going to be facing their predators. One of the big predators for these guys are very big seals, known as leopard seals. However, one of their biggest threats in the wild isn't actually predation. One thing that really affected them a few years ago is something known as guano mining. Now, if you don't know what guano is, it's basically a posh word for saying poo. So in this case, Humboldt penguin poo. So a few years ago, we realised that Humboldt penguin poo is a really, really effective fertiliser. So we scraped it all off the rocks and we took it home for ourselves. Now, you may not think this is that much of a big deal as it's a waste product for the penguins, but Humboldt penguins actually like to nest in their own guano. It sets as a very hard and thick substance, and if you ask any of the keepers here, they'll tell you how difficult it is to scrub off the rocks. So what they'll do is they'll make a nice thick layer and then they'll create a scrap. They'll lay their egg in it, and this will protect it from predators and also from the wind, the rain, all the elements and anything that could potentially be harmful to their clutch. So when we took away all this guano, it left their eggs really, really vulnerable, and because of that, their population numbers really suffered. The good news is, though, is that guano mining is now illegal and all Humboldt penguin nesting sites are now protected. However, there are obviously still threats that they're facing out there in the wild, and they are currently classed as vulnerable. So a few things that we can do is to help them is we can think about where we source our fish. Another threat that they face is competition with humans for food, which has led to overfishing. So the stocks of food that they would feed from out in the wild are really becoming depleted. So if we think about where we source our fish, that's one thing that we can be doing to help these guys. Another thing we can do is also keep them in captivity, like we have here. We keep a nice population in captivity, nice healthy population, keep the bloodline clean, then hopefully one day, if all those situations out in the wild become better managed, then maybe these guys' grandchildren or their grandchildren's children could be re-released out into the wild and ensure that this species is still around for future generations. We also breed our penguins here at Birdworld. I think since Birdworld's been going on, we've bred about 300 penguins, which is really, really cool. You can tell which ones are the juveniles. There's quite a few swimming at the front there because they're lacking that horseshoe-shaped marking on their chest, and their feathers are a lot more grey in coloration. Now, before I end this, clearly one bird right at the front that is not a penguin. This is a wild grey heron. If you look around, they've got hundreds of them nesting around. They know when we're going to feed our penguins. They're not our birds. They do it with the pelicans as well. They'll swoop in and try and get a bit of easy food for themselves. So yeah, I thought I'd just mention them as they're obviously just hanging around the penguins here. So that's about it from me. As for the rest of the day, the next talk is the owls, and that's at the Terry Pratchett Owl Parliament at the far end of the park. So if you're interested in owls, I'd recommend going along and having a listen to that. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening. I really hope you enjoy the rest of your day here at Birdworld. And can we also just give Kian a big round of applause for a great job at feeding our penguins this afternoon?